Hello. On behalf of the Historical Society of Harford County, welcome to this afternoon's presentation, Harford County Soldiers in the War of 1812. Before we begin, please be aware that this event is being recorded, and it will be made available publicly through the Historical Society's webpage and on the Society's YouTube channel. The Historical Society of Harford County collects, preserves, promotes, and interprets the rich and very diverse history of the Harford County area in its regional context, beginning with its prehistoric origins all the way to the present. The Society operates its headquarters at 143 North Main Street and the Hayes House Museum. Both are located in Bel Air, Maryland. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Society buildings are closed to the public, and we are holding events like this virtually. I'm Jackie Seneschal, your host for this virtual brown bag lunch. Our speaker today, Dr. Sandra Wallis, is the current Vice President of the Maryland State Society of the Daughters of 1812. She is also actively involved in the Daughters of the American Revolution. Sandy is the current chairman of the National Chairman for the Flag House and Star Spangled Banner Museum. She holds a doctorate from the University of Delaware. Sandy has 4 Harford County ancestors who participated in the Battle of Baltimore. So Sandy, please tell us the story of Harford County soldiers who fought in the War of 1812.
Thank you very much, Jackie. It is really an honor for me to be here today and share a favorite project of mine. I want to start by saying that there are people here at the Historical Society who know much more than I do about the War of 1812 and about some of these soldiers. Although I started out in life to teach American history, I did that for a very short period of time before taking on other responsibilities, and I'm just now circling back to my first love. So please keep in mind that I'm going to share what I know, but I'm not necessarily the expert. Here's an overview of what I want to share with you today. I hope to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, as well as for opportunities for others to share what they know about the men of 1812. I'm going to begin in the present with this project that I'm going to describe in just a moment, and talking about the men of 1812, who they were, and for this project, where they are buried. I'll share some of their stories. I'll share what they encountered when they went to Baltimore in September of 1814. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about how we should honor these veterans of the War of 1812. What I'm going to focus on today is primarily this 1812 veteran project. What brought me to this point was a chance meeting with a gentleman by the name of Mr. Sam Smith, who is a member of the Society of the War of 1812 in Maryland. He was introduced to me because he knew that people knew that I was a member of the Daughters of 1812, to see if the Daughters would like to collaborate with the Society, which is essentially the Sons of 1812, on this project. And so Sam had me hooked from that first meeting, and I've been working with him through that process ever since. Let me start by sharing a little bit about these two organizations. The Society of the War of 1812 was actually founded by the Old Defenders, and there's quite a bit of history about the Old Defenders. That organization was formed right after the Battle of Baltimore. The men who participated at Fort McHenry and at North Point knew that they had been a part of history and a part of something special. And they met regularly. They had ceremonies at various events, and especially during the commemoration of Defenders Day on September 14th. They kept the organization to themselves for many years, and then finally, as they began to die out, they invited their sons to join and their descendants to join, and it became the Society of the War of 1812 in Maryland. This organization is older than the parent organization, which is the General Society of the War of 1812. So Sam Smith, who was a member of that project, undertook the project of identifying the burial sites. I put some statistics on the screens for you, but the most important thing is he's identified over 6,000 burials of War of 1812 veterans in the state of Maryland. over 1,200 in Baltimore City alone. In Harford County, he's identified 321 burials. And those are burials where the veteran is in a public cemetery or a church cemetery, or maybe in a family cemetery that still exists. Sam is a perfect person to undertake this research. You'll see a picture there of a gentleman. That's Major General Sam Smith, who was in command of the Maryland militia during the War of 1812. He commanded the defenses of Baltimore at the Battle of Baltimore in September of 14. And Major General Sam Smith is our Sam Smith's many times great uncle. So Sam started with a volume that some of you may be familiar with. A gentleman by the name of F. Edward Wright compiled lists of the militia of the War of 1812 in Maryland from all of the counties. And so Sam started with that volume, which with county records, histories, and he worked with multiple sources in local historical societies. He worked with Hank Peden here, the Harford County Historical Society, as well as anyone else that he could find to talk to about these veterans. He used Find a Grave and other grave location repositories to discover where as many of them as possible were buried. He recorded all of his findings on Excel sheets, and those Excel sheets are organized by the county in which the veteran was buried. Now, the daughters, going back to Sam's work, the Society of the War of 1812 encouraged Sam, worked with Sam, supported Sam in his efforts, but it really was largely driven by the one man, Sam Smith himself. So when I met Sam, he asked about the daughters joining him in finding ways to circulate and publish and do something with all this research. And I've put up on this slide the purposes of the Daughters of 1812. And as Jackie mentioned at the beginning, I'm vice president of the state society at this time. But you can see that this project is right in line with our purposes, because we want to preserve and mark and record the families and the traditions of the soldiers of war of 1812. Daughters is organized into 5 chapters. Each serves a geographic region of the state. So we're kind of ideally positioned to carry out activities in Western Maryland, Central Maryland, Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, so that we can kind of spread the work around and hit all of the locations in the state of Maryland. How the daughters participated in his project. Some members individually assisted in the collection of the data. As I said at the beginning, this was Sam's project, and people who knew him chimed in to help and do some research for him and those kinds of things, but it wasn't a official kind of event. But presently, the State Society, actually in my direction, is assembling and training volunteers to take the work that's in Sam's database and kind of clean it up and reformat it to make it more accessible and sortable. So that, and we will publish it. Sam would like to publish it in a book. I'm concerned to get it on websites so that people can pull it down, research it, look at it, and do some things with it. The raw data is currently on the Society of the War of 1812 website, and I'm hoping in a year or two it'll be on the website for daughters as well. From there, we're going to encourage chapters of the daughters to hold commemorative events in collaboration with other organizations, in collaboration with the Society of the War of 1812, to mark graves, mark cemeteries, and find ways to recognize these soldiers. One idea that Sam had, I'd like to take credit for it because I think it's a great idea, is that on September 14th, which is the celebration of the the successful battle, defense of Fort McHenry, and the writing of the Star Spangled Banner, Sam would like us to adopt a cemetery and place the 15-star flag, which is known as the Star Spangled Banner flag, but was the flag that flew over Fort McHenry, on the 1812 veteran graves. And that's kind of a very public, but yet I won't say simple, but a fairly reasonable project to undertake. Now, that's enough on the project. That's how I got hooked into this. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Harford County and the men of Harford County and what they did. There are two campaigns that I want to talk about. The first is the Chesapeake Campaign of 1813. And the British really, really disliked Baltimore and Chesapeake Bay in particular. We were the home of the clipper ships. We were the people who would go out and harass their navy and harass their ships, and our ships were faster and they could attack them or take them and then run away. And so the British began blockading the east coast of the United States in 1812. But in March of 1813, they sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and began blockading the bay, actually pretty much the entire length of the bay. But they were up in our area from March to April and into May of 1813. They had a number of skirmishes in Cecil County and in Harford County, including, as many of you know, the May 3rd skirmish at Havre de Grace, where they burned the town. And many of our Harford County soldiers have their enlistment dates starting in April of 1813. And this is why. They were coming here to defend their land, basically, their county, from these attacks by the British along the Chesapeake. The second campaign I'm going to talk about a little bit more happened in 1814, and that's the defense of Baltimore, which included Fort McHenry and the battle at North Point. And you will notice, and when you look at the enlistments of some of these soldiers, that many of them enlisted twice, one for 1813, once for 1814. Some were only in 1813, and many more were only in 1814. So let's look at those people and what they did. Harford Countians, the militia, actually, I'm not an expert on the militia either, but as I understand it, the militia actually pre-existed. It's always kind of there, kind of like our National Guard. You know, the militia units could be called up whenever there was called for, whenever there was a concern. So in Harford County, most of the Countians who served in the War of 1812 served in three units, I'm going to call them: the 40th Regiment, the 42nd Regiment, and the 7th Cavalry. So I want to talk a little bit about those three units in the next couple of minutes. The 42nd Regiment seems to have been the largest. And the reason I think it was the largest is that it served in both campaigns and was particularly active at Hampstead Hill as a part of the 1st Brigade during the defense of Baltimore. This regiment was organized in Harford County. It included primarily Harford County men. It was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Smith, who was from Churchville. And William Smith owned a farm in Churchville, right off of Churchville Road. And when he died in 1835, he was buried on his farm. That land was donated by his family to create Smith's Chapel, what became Smith's Chapel United Methodist Church. And so now his grave, shown here in this picture, is at Smith's Chapel United Methodist Church. This is an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about how these regiments were organized. The 42nd Regiment was organized into 11 companies. Each company had a captain, a lieutenant, and an ensign, and 64 privates. I haven't done the math, but you can kind of figure out how many people that involved in terms of participation in a regiment. As I mentioned, the 42nd Regiment did defend all the Bush River, and as a part of some of the campaigns in the early part of the war in 1813, but they definitely went to Hampstead Hill and served at Hampstead Hill as a part of the 1st Brigade. And the 1st Brigade was commanded by Thomas Foreman from Cecil County. Second group I want to talk about is the 7th Regiment of the Harford County Cavalry. And that was commanded by Colonel John Street, who had an estate, I forgot the name of his estate, but he had an estate up near the rocks. And he was quite well known in the county. I believe his picture hangs in the Harford County Historical Society. In the Harford County Courthouse. And he was commended for his bravery and efficiency in action at the Battle of Baltimore, he was originally buried on his estate, but his family donated money to form Holy Cross Church. And so therefore his grave was moved to Holy Cross Cemetery. And you can see his stone here very, very clearly. It's in very good condition, and it clearly states what his position was and how he commanded the cavalry and also served in the legislature. I want to mention a little bit about cavalrymen here, because when we think of the cavalry, I think of, General Custer. The cavalry wasn't an official part of anything at that time in 1812. There wasn't an official U.S. cavalry, I don't believe, at that time. The cavalrymen were paid for their service, and they were paid for the maintenance of their horses, because the cavalry took their horses. They had been riding around their farms and working their farms and rode to Baltimore or to Havre de Grace, and their primary function was to deliver messages and provide escorts for various things. So it's not the cavalry as you know it if you think about some of the later battles the cavalry was involved in. The 4th Regiment is probably the least well-known. The 40th Regiment is probably the least well-known. It was organized in Harford County, and it was commanded by a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Turner. And frankly, it was very hard to find very much information about Lieutenant Colonel Turner. Unlike Colonel Smith, in the 42nd Cavalry, he was well documented, but I have not found this much about Lieutenant Colonel Turner. He's buried at Bethel Presbyterian Church, and I'm going to show, as you can see on his stone, it's very badly degraded. If you look at the base of his stone, someone has put a little concrete something to try to preserve some of the information that was on the stone, but even that is not very legible. So the 40th Regiment was very active in 1813 along the bush and along the bay. And then by the time 1814 came along and the defense of Baltimore, the 40th was consolidated with the 42nd. And so perhaps that's why it was not as well known because of that consolidation. I'm not sure. But I know that we know very little about Lieutenant Colonel Turner. Now some of the men whose names you might recognize. Also in the 40th was Stevenson Archer. And he's in Harford County that was marked by the Daughters of 1812. And my understanding from my husband, who's a member of the Society of the War of 1812, the men's group, I do not believe other graves have been marked for these soldiers. Stevenson Archer was the son of Dr. Archer, who had been a representative from Maryland. He was born at Medical Hall, a historic home near Churchville. He's buried at Churchville Presbyterian Church. He was a lawyer and a member of the Maryland House of Delegates. And during the War of 1812, he actually was elected as a representative to Congress and served in Congress during that period of time. I haven't researched the congressional records, but that was a time where the Congress was very involved in whether they should or should not declare war. That was quite a controversial national decision at that time. But during the war itself, he was the paymaster for the 40th Regiment. He went on to serve in Congress again. He ended his, following his service in Congress, he was appointed judge. He served in several judicial capacities and eventually ended his career as Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals. Probably one of the most famous or well-known of the Harford Countians to serve in the War of 1812 was Captain John Adams Webster. And Captain John Adams Webster served under Joshua Barney at both the Battle of Bladensburg and the Battle of Baltimore. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. He was born at Mount Adams, which is on 543. If you all know where Brooms Bloom Dairy is, it's right near there. And actually that home is occupied today by one of his descendants. He is buried on the family farm, and there is a Dallin Webster family cemetery on that farm. It's private. I assume you can ask to view it, but it's not a place that normally people visit. And Captain Webster began his naval career at the age of 14. At the Battle of Baltimore, he commanded a 6-gun battery between Forts McHenry and Covington. And legend has it, or reports have it, that he was the first person to see and discover and open fire on the British on the night of September 13th of 1814. This is a plaque that was placed, and I'm assuming it was placed by the family because there's no attribution on the plaque. But this is a plaque that is on the gravesite of John Adams Webster. And I know you can't read it, so I'm going to read a portion of it to you. It has one little inaccuracy that I'll correct when I come to it. Captain Webster began life as a sailor when 14 years old. In 1812, he served as captain under Commodore Barney, also in the flotilla on the Chesapeake, and in 1813 and 1814. And in the same command at the Battle of Bladensburg, August 21, 1814. And just to note, the Battle of Bladensburg is what led to the burning of Washington, D.C. in August of 1814. He was in command at the Battle of Bladensburg, August 21, 1814, in which action his horse was shot under him. After the battle, he marched to Baltimore with his sailors, and by General Smith's order took command of the 6-gun battery, from which on the night of the 18th of September, no, it wasn't the 18th, it was the 13th of September, 1814, he attacked the enemy's barge and defeated them with great loss, thereby rendering most efficient service in the defense of Baltimore. Now, the Historical Society's own Jim Crismer is a real expert on John Adams Webster. I had an occasion to hear him talk about John Adams Webster's life at a Society of the War of 1812 function at Mount Adams. And one thing that Jim stresses is that John Webster's career did not end in the Battle of Baltimore and in the War of 1812. He served in the Mexican-American War. He became ill while serving with a flotilla in the Mexican-American War. And following the Mexican-American War, he actually volunteered to take a naval command in the Civil War, but Lincoln did not appoint him to that position. So he has quite an extensive and quite impressive career as a naval officer. I threw in John Forward, and I chose to highlight him for 2 reasons. Number one, he's my 5th great grandfather. And that's part of my reason for being so interested in the War of 1812 is all of my ancestors who participated. He's not one of the ones who went to Baltimore. He was born in Delaware and raised in Harford County. It was his uncle and father-in-law, because he married his first cousin, owned what was then Forward's Mill and is now Walter's Mill. And he and his wife, Hannah, lived in, they called it a plantation, right directly across from Walter's Mill. So if you're familiar with 543 and Walter's Mill Road, the white brick house there was John Forward's. He was a member of the Maryland legislature from Harford County during the War of 1812. And the reason I wanted to highlight him is that there are others who served. They did not necessarily serve as a soldier, but they also participated and supported the war effort. And I've read the records of the legislature of the Maryland during this particular time. And President Madison was having a difficult time getting states to send money to support the War of 1812. And John Forward consistently supported Madison's request for funding. The interesting thing is there were the bill would be presented and there'd be lots of amendments. And John Forward would vote against the amendment, against the amendment, against the amendment. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure he's not going to vote for this bill. But when the bill finally came back around, he voted for the bill. Because what his point was, he knew what he wanted to do. He didn't want it amended. He just wanted to approve the money to go to Madison. And Maryland sent supplies and monies to support the war effort. And Harford County was an area in the state that was pretty consistent in supporting the war. That wasn't necessarily true in other parts of the state, but Harford County consistently supported it. I want you to look at John Forward's tombstone. You can hardly read it. And this is one of my concerns. We're losing these stones because of just time. He died in 1835. This stone is almost 200, well, a little less than 200 years old, and they are really being degraded. I feel like if we don't do something to preserve this history, we're going to lose what these gentlemen did. Now I want to talk about a couple of cemeteries, because what Sam is doing is he's organizing his records by the name of the man, but you can also look at each individual church. And so I did that because that was one of my interests, is how do we preserve the records at these churches? And so the first church I want to highlight is Bethel Presbyterian. Some of you know that. I believe I say Jarrettsville, but supposedly it's Madonna. And Sam identified 33 War of 1812 veterans buried at that church. I mean, to me, that's just amazing. I have not started to document them. I'll talk a little bit when I talk about Christ Episcopal, what the documentation entails. But he has the list, and we're trying to go through and verify that that's the right person and that we can capture some of their life story, not just their service in the War of 1812, but some of their life story. I mentioned earlier that Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Turner of the 40th Regiment is buried there. There are 2 captains, Joshua Amos from the 42nd. And remember, I mentioned that each of the 11 companies had a captain. And so these 2 gentlemen were captains of 2 of the 11 companies of the 42nd. There were 22 privates, several corporals, ensigns, sergeants, and an ensign who are buried here at Bethel Presbyterian. I mentioned Christ Episcopal, and that's where I started, partly because, again, I have an ancestor buried there. It's the church cemetery with the 2nd largest number of War of 1812 veterans buried there. I believe there are 25. I think Sam had documented 24, and I think I found one more. So what I've been doing for those is the Daughters of 1812 have a website, or have a database on their website that documents the grave locations of all of the, grave locations of veterans of the War of 1812, not all of the veterans, because people like me, people in Texas, people in Virginia are sending in these grave location forms. And the grave location form identifies the soldier, identifies his service, identifies where he's buried, identifies any pertinent information you have, like when he was born, when he died, who he married, who his children were. And so that information is then entered into their database. Now, for those of you who want to rush out and look at the database immediately after this, it's not up right now. We've taken it down because we are behind in entering some of the data. And so they're trying to enter some of these forms and convert it to a new format and get it back up. So I'm hoping within the next year it's back up there so that everybody can access it. So I have been verifying and completing the grave locations for the veterans buried at Christ Episcopal. And from this, I'll move on to do, I'm kind of daunted by Bethel because we're 33, but I'm going to move on and do Bethel, because this is where the hard work kind of gets in. When you do these grave location forms, you're actually verifying Sam's research. You're also verifying Sam Smith's research. You're also verifying the information about whether that is indeed the man who was cited in F. Edward Wright's book. So it takes a little bit of work to do those forms. It's kind of fun. You learn a lot. Two burials that I want to highlight at Christ Episcopal. One is Edward Morgan, and I found him interesting because he was a volunteer artillerist at Fort McHenry. Now, most of our men served in the regiments and were at the Battle of North Point, or what's called the Defense of Baltimore, the second aspect of it, or were along the Chesapeake. But Edward Morgan was with Lieutenant Colonel George Armistead at Fort McHenry. And then the next one I want to kind of highlight is Dr. James Montgomery. And I find him interesting because he kind of highlights the importance of the old defenders. I found a copy of his obituary in the Aegis when he died. Forgive me, don't have the date right here, but he died late in the 1800s. And in fact, he was the second, I don't know how to say this. After he died, there was only one more remaining member of the 7th Cavalry. And that gentleman was at his burial. But Dr. James Montgomery was a doctor. He was raised in Harford County, educated at University of Maryland, did his practice, it seems, predominantly in Baltimore City, but kind of must have always viewed Harford County as his home because his funeral was carried out from his house in Baltimore, and then he was brought up to Christ Episcopal for service and buried in the Christ Episcopal church yard. The interesting things in his obituary is, I would say, more than half of it is devoted to old defenders. And it points out that he was an old defender, that he had served in the unit, that a number of his pallbearers were old defenders and they were identified, and that the last surviving old defender from the 7th Cavalry attended his funeral. So I found that kind of interesting, that for these men, being part of that was really, really important to them. And we're just lucky to have that Dr. Montgomery lived long enough that we could read his obituary and see his pride in that. Another one at Christ Episcopal I want to talk about, because it also highlights something about Sam's research. Reverend Keach was the pastor at Christ Episcopal for more than 40 years. I have used the transcriptions of his church registry and some of his family research, and some of you may have done the same. He was actively serving at Christ Episcopal at the time he died. His obituary alluded to the fact that he had been out visiting parishioners when he was suddenly taken ill and passed away. His church records have been transcribed. They are in the Historical Society, they're in the Genealogical Society bulletins, and a lot of people are familiar with his records. He seemed to be a very good record keeper. The interesting thing to me about Reverend Keach is that he grew up in St. Mary's County and served in the War of 1812 in St. Mary's County. His enlistment period is different. I didn't put the dates on this slide. I probably should have. But from the dates of his enlistment, it seems to me that he was most likely involved in some of the preliminaries to the Battle of Bladensburg, which, as I mentioned earlier, led to the burning of Washington, D.C. Because his enlistment period is in July and August of 1814. And so during the burning of Washington and the Battle of Bladensburg, the British landed down in the St. Mary's, Charles County area and marched up to Bladensburg. So that's why I haven't investigated that, but I kind of am assuming that Reverend Keach, as a young man, was involved in that. So when Sam did his research, Reverend Keach appears on the St. Mary's County roll as a member of the militia, and he could not find where he had been buried. When I was doing the work on St. Mary's, on Christ Episcopal, I said, I wonder. And so I conferred with Sam, and sure enough, we were able to directly link that this Reverend Keach was indeed the one who served in St. Mary's. And so now he's been added to the Harford County list, but his service shows as St. Mary's service. The final person I want to talk about at Christ Episcopal is Samuel Hady, and I picked him for a number of reasons. He's just an ordinary man, a farmer from Hickory. He also happens to be one of my ancestors. This is one who did go to down to the Battle of Baltimore, went down to Hampstead Hill and prepared to fight the British. He was a private in the Seventh Regiment Cavalry. I highlight him for a couple of other reasons. Number one, looking at his stone, you can see that it's also badly degraded, very hard to read. But he also represents a characteristic of some of our soldiers. He was the son of a Revolutionary War soldier who served in the militia during the Revolutionary War. And that was very true of many of our 1812 soldiers. They either had fathers or uncles or close relatives who had served in the American Revolution and had supported it. So that idea of patriotic service to your country was really up front for many of them. Another interesting thing about Samuel Hady is he was the grandson of Jonathan Hady. So he was only 2 generations removed from his immigrant ancestor. Jonathan Hady was very well known and respected in Harford County, but his trip to Harford County was a little bit different. He was a transported English prisoner, and one of his descendants, a woman that I don't know, but I know that she worked at the Harford County Historical Society gathering some of her research, actually had an English researcher pull his trial in England, and he was sentenced to die. And then shortly before the sentence was to be enacted, it was commuted and he was transported to Harford County, what was then Baltimore town, I believe, in the Joppa area. And so in 1737, he traveled aboard the Pretty Patsy as a transported prisoner and came to Harford County. So I think that I'm saying that this kind of illustrates how close many of these men were to the origins of our country. I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit, too fast there, about this Battle of Baltimore that I keep talking about. When people think about 1814 and the defense of they think of the defense of Fort McHenry, because the bombardment of Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key's story, the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, everybody knows. But there were 2 parts to that initiative, and the second was a landing. And that part was key to each part, I should say, was a key to their plan to take Baltimore. And I feel that the Battle of North Point is way too often ignored. British troops landed on the tip end of the North Point Peninsula in the general area of today's Fort Howard. There was no fort there at the time. It was just a spit of land, peninsula. They landed there, and their goal was to come around the city. The Navy was going to take Fort McHenry, and then they would surround the city and capture Baltimore. So what happened at North Point? So 2 days after the burning of Washington, D.C., now think about this. Baltimore could see the smoke from Washington, D.C. They knew the British hated them. They knew the British were sailing up and down the Chesapeake Bay. George Armistead knew they were coming. That's why he had that great big giant flag made. He was prepared. He knew it was just a matter of time before they came to Baltimore. And so the forces had to say, where do we think they're going to come? What do we think they're going to do? And they guessed right. They thought they would come around the east side of the city, which was up North Point Peninsula and in the general area of what is today's Patterson Park. And sure enough, that's where they came. So 2 days after the burning of DC, Baltimore started erecting huge trenches and earthworks at Hampstead Hill. These trenches, I understand, were like 2 miles long and stretched from Johns Hopkins Hospital and around. It was a huge project. And I understand that the male population of Baltimore City just emptied out, and everybody was out there trying to participate in this, to the point where there's one story that they had to tell the bakers to go back to the city and bake bread because they needed the bread to feed the troops at Hampstead Hill. And they didn't have that because the bakers were all out there helping dig trenches. This records say that 15,000 men were assembled by September 9th. Other records say it was probably 20 to 25,000 men by the time of September 13th and 14th. Those men were going to face 5,000 veteran British soldiers. Now, it looks as if, well, 20,000 versus 5 looks like a sure thing. But these soldiers, these British soldiers, had fought Napoleon. I mean, they were not inexperienced farmers out there with their hunting rifles. They were very experienced soldiers. And so it was a very, very tense and very serious time. And among those men assembled were our Harford County soldiers. Quite a few were there. In the 42nd Regiment, in the 7th Cavalry, a lot were there. So what happened? Well, on the march, they lost their commander. They learned that things were not going well at Fort McHenry. The weather was atrocious. They had horrible weather, rain, and the men did not have their packs with them to sleep because they thought they were going to be sleeping in houses in Baltimore City that night. And so when they arrived at Hampstead Hill and saw the defenses, they decided to retreat. And so they turned around and went back to their ships, burning a few things along the way, and sailed away. So our soldiers at Hampstead Hill saw very little service, but their presence there deterred the British from their goal. And I think that those men were prepared to lay down their lives. The fact that they didn't have to is a good thing, but they were prepared to give their lives for this cause. So I'm going to cycle back and conclude by talking a little bit about this project that I've been interested in. And I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but these cemeteries are memorials to these men. They don't have other memorials. In many cases, they're buried with their families. In Colonel John Street, it showed on his tombstone his service, but most of them, there's no record of their service. You would never know that you were walking past the grave of someone who was prepared to fight for our country in 1812. And I think that that's worth doing and worth investing time in, to honor these men, to mark and protect their burial locations, and to preserve and tell their stories. And so thank you very much. That's my story, and I'm willing to entertain any questions you might have. Okay, I've got to turn it over. Sorry.
Sorry, I was having trouble finding the unmute button. That was my fault. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really fascinating to hear the stories of these men from Harford County who fought in the War of 1812. So we're going to open it up now to questions. I guess the first thing I'll just share with you, and you probably already know this, Sandy, the Veterans Administration will issue headstones to replace worn out or broken headstones for veterans if the family and the descendants approved. But at that point, the old one has to be removed. And so that probably presents its own set of challenges. Where do you put these important artifacts?
I'm trying. Okay. I was just trying to. Sorry, I was doing my last little job there.
Okay. One of the questions we have is, do you happen to know what year Samuel Hady was, you said Samuel Hady, was that his name, was transported from England?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, that's what I thought.
Yeah, he was born in 1815 in England, as I understand it, and he was transported in 1837.
16.
It can't be 18.
1715, and he was transported in 1737. So he was a fairly young man when he came here. And there is an article talking about the contributions of transported prisoners, and he's cited as an example of someone who came to this country and made a positive difference.
All right. Oops. Let's go on. There was another, here we go, another question. Are there resources available to identify those who served from Harford County but are buried elsewhere, such as in Pennsylvania?
Yes, I didn't talk about that. Sam Smith has identified over 1,000 who are in of Harford County patriots buried in other states. It's a little more difficult because you have to have some kind of a hint or tip that the veteran moved to another state. But if you know where they moved, then Sam has been able to go and find where they were buried. So it's a little more challenging than it is in the state of Maryland, but I think it's over 1,000 that he's identified that are out of state. I have to look back at my notes and see. So he's still working on his out of state list, because he emails me practically every day and says, I found another one. So yes, the short answer is yes.
Okay, this is a question from me. I recently visited the cemetery at St. Mary's in Pilesville, and I noticed that several of the graves are marked with War of 1812 markers. The first thing I'll tell you is those markers don't look like either of the ones that you showed at the very beginning of the presentation. How would someone check to see if those graves are already part of the inventory, or whether there are other graves in that cemetery or others that might be unmarked? How would you go about helping with this project?
Well, the first thing I'm trying to do is to take the list that Sam Smith has created for Harford County and look through it. And right now it's not easily sortable, but what we're doing is to create, make better columns so that it can be sorted by cemetery. So when it's sorted by cemetery, it shows you who's buried in each cemetery in Harford County. And then once you have that information, then you can match it against the church cemetery records. And the way, for example, how I proceeded with Christ Episcopal is I took Sam's list and I verified that they were there and that they had served. But then I also looked and I saw, well, here's some other men who lived in that time period. Wonder if they could have been, and that's how I found Reverend Keach. So Sam Smith has done a very good job of documenting these people, but that doesn't mean he hasn't missed a few. And so that's how I would suggest that we proceed, that anyone who's interested proceed. And I'm hoping shortly we'll have a better idea of a better file that can be sorted, because right now it's because of the way he did his notes, it gets all scrambled up when you start to sort them. But we're fixing that, hopefully.
Okay. Do you have any idea what are there other medallions that were put up by other groups for War of 1812 veterans? Because I said several of these veterans are marked with a medallion, but that doesn't look like either of the ones that you showed.
I'll have to look. My suspicion, and it's just a suspicion, do the medallions look like they're old?
Relatively. I mean, they were not placed last week. But they don't look, they've been there for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have any idea how long.
Yeah, whether it could have been the old defenders themselves who, or their descendants who did something. But I'll investigate. I think that I can get a picture of one of them, and then the society, the men's group, is probably the most likely source of information. So I'll go to the Society of the War of 1812. My husband, who is sitting here, is the current vice second vice president. So I think I can check with them and see if they have any idea where they came from.
Well, I can send you a copy, or I can send you a picture of them. And
Okay,
when I
great.
took the picture, it shows the medallion, which is what I was able to, so I looked at it. Okay, other things we have here from other folks. We have a comment from someone who grew up off Old North Point Road, where the British moved toward Baltimore. And for their work, they taught at Hampstead Hill. This person made the point that the Battle of North Point was actually a delaying action to allow for the building of the defenses of at Hampstead Hill, at Hampstead still.
I didn't mention the skirmishes along the way, but yes, they sent men, I believe under John Stricker, the person can correct me on that, to harass the British as they were marching up the North Point Peninsula, heading toward Hampstead Hill or heading toward Baltimore. They didn't know they were heading toward Hampstead Hill. I'm sure they had scouts that they knew, what was waiting for them. But there were skirmishes along the way, and supposedly two men, they weren't from, they actually have Harford County roots, or at least McComas does. Wells and McComas supposedly were snipers positioned in a tree, and the legend is that they are the ones who shot the British General Ross and killed him, and that was a huge deterrent, the loss of him, and then the second in command having to take over. There are others who say no, they don't think it was Wells and McComas, but Wells and McComas are officially recognized in Baltimore City with a monument as being the people who killed Ross and basically really deterred the British from reaching Hampstead Hill in full battle mode, so to speak. Yes.
Okay, another comment. I understand that a Harford County soldier was responsible. Okay, that you just told it. Do you know where McComas is buried?
He's buried at the mine. He was buried somewhere else, but they're, as I understand it, they were moved, both Wells and McComas, and they're buried beneath the monument. Am I correct? Yes, they're buried beneath the monument, the Wells and McComas Monument, which is in Baltimore City. And interesting, my son used to live off North Point Road. The VFW down there is the Wells and McComas VFW down along the North Point Road. So yeah, they're quite heroes in that area.
Let me see, we've got, somebody made the point that the Dundalk Historical Society does a reenactment of the battle every year in September.
Yeah, they do a very nice, it's Fort McHenry is one weekend and the North Point celebration is the weekend before. And we go down, I go representing the daughters and my husband goes representing the sons, and we set up a display table and they have a reenactment. Some of our friends participate in the reenactment. They often have a ship actually sail up in front of the peninsula. It's a really, really interesting and pleasant day. A lot of organizations set up. There are a lot of activities. There are skits. Some of you may have heard David Hildebrand. I've heard him twice down there doing the music of 1812. It's really a very, very nice day down there. And it's actually on Fort Howard is where that activity takes place.
Okay, now here we have another comment from someone has a military card from Fold 3 where their ancestor, Elijah Egan, served in the 41st Maryland Militia under Hutchins, part of the 11th Brigade, and was one of the men at Hampstead Hill. That card on Fold 3 is just an index card, and they can't locate it any other military records. The man was a Baltimore resident, but moved to Ohio in 1826 and is buried out there. You have any idea where you could find more records or how they could look at the records, for instance, that Sam Smith has collected to verify whether this person is listed on those?
Yes, probably if you would send that information to me, I would be, or give them my email address, I'd be happy to direct them a little more specifically because it's kind of a little complicated. But because the 41st, I'm not sure which area that Baltimore, might have been Baltimore City. But the interesting thing is that I think it was 1850 that Congress authorized the bounty land claims for the soldiers of 1812. But many of them didn't live long enough to claim the bounty land, nor did their widows. The widows, for example, one of mine, the widow claimed the bounty land, one of mine claimed his bounty land, and the others were gone, and no one claimed their bounty land. So if he had a bounty land claim number, which Sam's record does give you the information if they have a bounty land claim, then that bounty land claim includes testimony. And so that testimony often gives, because they have to prove they were there.
Right.
And so that often gives a lot of information that really is helpful and very interesting to people for that. So it could have been, if he lived long enough, it could have been either him or his widow could have claimed a bounty land.
Okay, one more question about the Battle of Baltimore. The trench you mentioned in the presentation, can you tell us where we can look to find more information about that, or anything else people want to know about the particulars of the Battle of Baltimore?
There are a lot of, there are a number of books. I have to be honest, I can mention one that I haven't read. It's Terror on the Chesapeake, the Chris George book. And he is the one who wrote the publication that is cited here, the 76 Harford County in the War of 1812. That was written by Christopher George. He's actually an Englishman, but he's written an awful lot about the War of 1812 and the War of 1812 in Maryland. So Terror on the Chesapeake might be a place to start. I'll try to, I'm kind of drawing a blank right now. So there are a lot of other books that really talk about that. Probably, see, that's the problem, is that books that I might mention focus a lot more on Fort McHenry, which I think is unfortunate, because I think the Battle of North Point, to me, was just as significant. And even though they didn't actually fire any guns at the people at Hampstead Hill, there were the skirmishes along the way. So I'll do some more research on that. But right this minute, I can't think of another one. But Terror on the Chesapeake might be a place to start.
Okay, someone had asked a specific question about if a cemetery has changed hands from one denomination to another. Do the cemetery records transfer hands? How would you go about redoing research in those cases?
My husband's sitting here laughing because that's a problem. Not a problem necessarily. Cemeteries, even if they stayed in the same church, it's issues. In many churches, for example, the Methodist churches where mine are all, not all of them, obviously, I've got one at Episcopal, but I know the Methodist churches, the church does not own the cemetery. The cemetery is owned by the Cemetery Association that is affiliated with the church. And so the church doesn't keep the cemetery records. The Cemetery Association keeps the cemetery records. Now, the church records would show the burials, but they don't necessarily have the cemetery records. So that's part of the first question, is who owns the cemetery? And then does that cemetery, there should be a chain of command. For example, my husband's been trying to straighten out some records at Center in Forest Hill. And that cemetery is not even close to a church anymore. It's out on Rocks Road. And in any case, those records have been passed down from hand to hand to hand, and someplace along the line, some of the names were confused, some of the sites were confused, and so he's been trying to help get the right person in the right plot, so to speak. But, and not to say that that's anybody's fault, that's just what happens when a cemetery's been there for a very long time. So I guess the first step is to find out who owns it.
Okay.
And then that should help you figure it out.
Bill Walden, you had a couple of questions you wanted to ask.
Yes. There's a small cemetery. I think the town is called Webster, which is near Level, right? Are there any 1812 soldiers buried in that cemetery?
I don't know that particular cemetery, but I can make a general statement in that you have to think about when the cemetery was established.
It has some very old stones there.
Then probably. If you've got stones that are older than 1820, 1830, I'm pretty sure they're going to find. And I can look with the name of that information. I can look and see. But that's the first thing is how old is the cemetery? And then once you know, many of the 1812 soldiers are buried on family farms, and we have no idea where they are, and we'll never be able to find them. I mean, I think over half of mine are buried on family farms, and we have no idea where they are. So,
and
when
time's getting
it's a
short.
really old cemetery, it's likely that there's somebody there.
Okay.
Okay, Bill, did you have one more question and then we'll wrap it up?
I'm good.
Okay. We have had a request for your email, Sandy, and I'm going to offer you two options. One, you can give your email, or if you would prefer, we can invite people to submit their questions through information at the Historical Society, put in the subject line for Sandi Wallis, and we'll be happy to forward that question to you. What would your preference be?
I'm comfortable giving my email address, and I will caution people, you need to pay attention to how my last name is spelled. My email address is swallis, which is SWALLIS, USD1812 @gmail.com. I'll repeat that. Wallis, and Wallace is spelled WALLIS, USD1812 @gmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you again. This has just been fascinating. So I want to thank you and everybody who's attended for participating and asking such good questions on this session on Harford County soldiers in the War of 1812. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation or becoming a member of the Historical Society of Harford County. You can do this either by visiting our website at www.harfordhistory.org, where you can also purchase copies of the two bulletins shown on your screen that have more information on Harford Countians in the War of 1812. Our next virtual event is January the 23rd at 2 p.m., and it's the start of a new series called Oh, the Stories We Can Tell. The first interview is with our own Carol Dybel, who's going to discuss the history of 20th century development in the town of Bel Air. The 1-hour event is free and it begins at 2 p.m. on January the 23rd. Reserve your ticket today at the Society's website. On the website, you'll find a list of other upcoming events, more about the history of Harford County, and instructions for how to join us. That web address is www.harfordhistory.org. Thank you so much, and please join us for future events.
Thank you.